If you've missed the last 2 weeks of the channel, well, I guess technically you haven't missed much. I mean, 2 weeks ago it was the disappointing Superman for the Genesis, which was a severe letdown from Sunsoft's other DC-related titles on the console. And then last week was the flat-out awful Flintstones for the Master System, which was just another level of bad, thankfully rarely seen on the channel. So this week, with an open slot in the schedule, I really needed a good game to review, like desperately. And while I could have chosen a game that I knew was good as a palate cleanser, I decided to live dangerously instead, and gamble on hoping to find a diamond in the rough, a hidden gem if you will, on a game that I had never played either in this incarnation or its original presentation in the arcades. And that game is Dynamite Duke, specifically for the Genesis. Now, there's also a port of this for the Master System that we'll get to in another 100 episodes or so. I've already got a copy of it. But in this case, I wanted to start out with the Genesis version, due to the fact that it came out first, with the North American version releasing just in time for the Genesis' second Christmas in the United States in December of 1990, and only about a month or so after it made its original debut in Japan. Also, since this is my first taste of Dynamite Duke, I figured the Genesis version would probably be the closest to the arcade original, presenting what I hoped would be an authentic version of the game. Now, who knows? Maybe eventually I'll find out that the Master System version is better. Anything is possible. However, I should probably pause for a second because, I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now confused because, you're not familiar with Dynamite Duke. And when you think of a Sega-related game with dynamite in the title, you think of a couple of ducks. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where somehow I just managed to make an even more obscure reference to Bruce Willis than Dynamite Cop. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD, as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Now, Dynamite Duke is one of those games from that pre-Sonic the Hedgehog era of the Genesis, when the Genesis was all about trying to get across the message that the only way to truly play arcade games at home was on the 16-bit powerhouse. And, they were pretty successful at that with, say, Ghouls and Ghosts, Forgotten Worlds, Golden Axe, and Strider, all giving the arcade versions a run for their money, with releases that made the NES look like the ancient relic from 1983 that it was. But like 3 of those 4 titles I just mentioned, Dynamite Duke actually wasn't a Sega title. The arcade version was a release from arcade game manufacturer Seibu Kaihatsu, who you probably know better as the developers of the legendary vertical shooter Raiden. And no, we're not doing the whole Raiden versus Raiden thing right now. And while yes, the Genesis version was published by Sega, it was actually developed by Hertz Limited. Again, you might not be familiar with Hertz by name, but no, we're not talking about the terrible rental car company here. But Hertz was notable for a certain other arcade port on the Genesis that you definitely have heard of in their version of Outrun. And no, I have no idea why Sega didn't port Outrun themselves, but Hertz seemed to do a pretty good job with that port, as it got 3 stars from me all the way back in episode 76. So did Hertz step up to the plate and deliver with Dynamite Duke? Was the original arcade game any good to begin with? And how many times have I accidentally thought about Duke Nukem during this intro? Well, we'll look at all that and more, but first, a look at the package. And here's my copy of Dynamite Duke for the Genesis. This is one that I'm pretty sure that I've had for a long time, due to the fact that I have no memory whatsoever of buying it, so it was probably bought pretty early on in the collection. I wouldn't say it's a super common title, especially since it's a 1990 release, but it's not one that I think is overly rare either. You can probably find it if you look hard enough. This particular copy is in decent shape. There are some blemishes to the outer cover, especially on the rear. Don't know what happened there. But there's no actual holes or tears in the plastic, and the hang tab is intact at the top of the case. The inner cover, like the outer cover, isn't perfect, but it's in decent enough shape, especially if you're not looking too closely.
There's no sun bleaching or water damage, and there's just the slightest amount of edge wear to the bottom. As mentioned, due to the game not being that uncommon, complete copies are currently going for $35 to $40 on average, and even getting up to $50 for really clean copies. So I'll just be holding on to this one unless I happen to catch it on sale at a convention or something. As far as the front cover goes, this is one that has always stood out to me, but not necessarily for good reasons. I think at first I was drawn to the military font logo that's used at the bottom, with especially the Duke portion looking very similar to the font used in the A-Team logo, but of course colored army green. But then there's the actual cover art, or more accurately the photo cover, at a time when photo covers weren't very common, especially in arcade conversions. I wouldn't say it's bad necessarily, but it's definitely confusing. For instance, if you've seen the arcade game in action, this doesn't look anything like Duke. So, is this instead just some random bad guy that you're up against? Perhaps the final boss of the game? Or is it Duke, but since the people designing the cover didn't actually know what Duke looked like in the game, they instead just put a random Green Beret looking guy with an Uzi on the cover? I'm going to go with that one. Europe got a similar cover, just cropped slightly differently, so not much to discuss there, but Japan of course did things a bit differently, with actual art and the original arcade logo on a wraparound cover. This resembles Duke from the game a bit closer, especially with the visible robotic arm, but I don't remember Duke being shirtless. I saw someone mention that the art was supposed to be based on Dolph Lundgren, especially in his Ivan Drago persona from Rocky IV, and, I can kind of see it, and that would explain the whole shirt-off thing. I've got to be honest, I don't love either of these covers. The US just doesn't seem like they knew what they were doing, but then the Japanese cover is a bit over the top and not really representative of the game either, so, take your pick on this one, I guess. Flipping over the back, and we've got that classic Genesis rear cover with one large screenshot followed by two smaller ones with flavor text on the side. The screenshots are great and make the game look action-packed while showing off multiple levels and enemies. Along with that, the flavor text is solid as well, and does a great job of explaining and hyping up the game to those that might not be familiar with it. I've got no complaints here, and I especially love this line, "Your bionic punch is vicious." Opening up the box, and the manual isn't in perfect shape, but it's held up well. It's a traditional Sega manual from the time period, starting out with a full page giving a detailed backstory to the game, one of the things that I always appreciated Sega doing in their manuals, no matter how batshit crazy the story was. Then on the next page, for the controls, I like how it's not just fire, punch, and kick, it's fire, punch, and kick, all with exclamation points. The rest of the manual is about what you would expect, with plenty of screenshots and a solid explanation of gameplay. Being that this is an arcade game port, you probably don't need the manual, but it definitely looks like they put more effort into it than the front cover, that's for sure. Okay, that's the package. Let's get into the game and see if the explosive action lives up to the Dynamite name. If you're of a certain age, you probably remember that feeling of walking into an arcade with just rows and rows of similar-sized cabinets. And of course the skee-ball or other ticket games over the side, but I'm specifically talking about the arcade cabinets. This was back before you had the current arcade scene, which focuses more on large, deluxe machines with giant screens and seated attractions. And yes, depending on the arcade operator, you had your deluxe Outrun or Afterburner occasionally back then, but for the most part, the arcade machines were these stand-up cabinets that were almost daring you to step up and put a quarter in. And then another, and then another. While early on, a lot of those games had simpler platformer mechanics, usually in a single-screen design like Frogger or Dig Dug, as the 80s rolled on, action started to be the name of the game, whether it was a beat-em-up like Double Dragon, or a game with some gunplay like, say, Heavy Barrel. If you had to describe Dynamite Duke with a feeling, it's just that, which is appropriate considering that it was originally an arcade action title from the 80s, first appearing as a single-player cabinet in July of 1989. If you remember Dynamite Duke as being a two-player game, don't worry, this isn't a Mandela effect thing. It was also released as a two-player cabinet 2 months later in September of 1989, just retitled a more appropriate The Double Dynamites. Whichever version of the game you played, it had all sorts of large sprites, gunfire, and explosions that seeks to put you squarely in the middle of the action, and with you controlling your virtual, Arnold Schwarzenegger or Jean-Claude Van Damme as you blow the living crap out of whatever diabolical enemy that's trying to take over the world this week. The arcade machine features in-your-face action, literally, with enemies that can jump straight to the front of the screen as you control Dynamite Duke, who is on a mission to find Dr. Neil Ash, a mad scientist out to take over what remains of the Earth 100 years in the future, with mutated science experiments and a literal army ready to defend him. Duke's primary weapon of choice is a semi-automatic machine pistol that he wields in his left hand, but when the action gets up close and personal, he's also a master of hand-to-hand combat and can utilize his fists and feet to take on all comers, with the focus being on his robotic right. And when things get really crazy, Duke can unleash a dynamite punch which damages all enemies on screen, giving you a chance to catch your breath or potentially take a boss down a few notches, if you've managed to be strategic with their use. The game takes place over 9 levels, or more accurately 8 levels plus a final boss showdown against Dr. Ash in all of his mutated forms. Even though Dynamite Duke fit right in with the other arcade action titles of the time, it wasn't overly popular, and would only end up being ported to home computers and consoles 3 times, with the version from today's review first appearing for the Mega Drive in Japan in October of 1990, and then a month later the Genesis version making it out to market before Christmas of that year. As with most arcade ports on the Genesis, even though the console was well suited to adapt 16-bit arcade games, there would have to be some cuts made to make the game function on the Genesis' more limited hardware, and of course less available ROM space, with Hertz delivering Dynamite Duke to Sega on a relatively standard for the time 4 megabit cartridge. Having said that, you're probably wondering what are you not getting with the Genesis version as opposed to the arcade. Well, from a purely structural perspective, one way to save space is to cut levels, and that's exactly what Hertz did, with the Genesis version only having 6 of the 8 main levels from the arcade, but still retaining the final boss showdown at the end. That might sound like a pretty big cut to lose essentially 25% of the game, but in Hertz's defense, one of the 2 levels that was cut is relatively short and doesn't even feature a boss showdown at the end of it, so you're not losing as much as you might think. And personally, after playing both the arcade version and the Genesis version, I think even with the level cuts, the spirit of Dynamite Duke is still carried over. However, where I really see a difference between the 2 versions is more in the graphical presentation of the game, and this is something that can squarely be pointed back to the hardware limitations of the Genesis and not space issues. Keep in mind, Duke has 2 ways of attacking, either shooting with his machine pistol, or various upgraded weaponry if he's grabbed a Magnum or a bazooka, or resorting to hand-to-hand combat for closer enemies. In both versions of the game, enemies can appear and move back and forth on one of 4 horizontal lines, which give the game a shooting gallery type feel, as you'll fire your gun at enemies on the back 3 lines. However, if an enemy is on the front line, you cannot shoot them, and you have to either try to avoid them or dispatch them with punches and kicks. It's pretty straightforward, and you get used to having to switch from the gun to a more punch-out style of offense relatively quickly, complete with being able to see through Duke just like in Punch-Out. Having said that though, the 2 versions of the game differ in how they handle that frontline activity. The arcade version will put regular enemies on that front line that you'll have to deal with as you make your way through the levels, while the Genesis version limits the frontline activity to just the boss fights. Like the levels that had to be removed from the game, while it would be nice if this level of action was still included in the Genesis version, because it makes the action from the arcade version seem that much more intense and in your face, I actually don't mind that much that it was removed, because now it makes the boss fights feel more special, as you have to change tactics specifically for them, and not just try to blast your way through everything. The Genesis version omitting the frontline enemies is just one of the changes that was made from a graphics perspective. Without those enemies, most of the rest of the sprites used are smaller, which of course are easier for the Genesis to handle. But not all of them. The helicopter and armored personnel carrier sub-bosses are still in the game, and they look strikingly similar to the original version, taking up a large portion of the screen, something that was not common in 1990 on home consoles. Beyond that, there's other graphical changes, but almost all of them simply fall into the category of having less detail than the arcade version. For any of the changes made graphically, I wouldn't say any of them make the game look bad or subpar, just simply not as good. And if you hadn't played the arcade game, of course, you wouldn't know any better. On its own, and especially for what I essentially consider a first-year title for the console, I think Dynamite Duke holds its own from a graphical perspective, as there's still plenty of things going on screen at one time, and there's never any slowdown or flickering that's common to shooters. And there's still the occasional nice graphical touch, like carrying over being able to see through Duke from the arcade. Much more distressing than the lower fidelity visuals of the game is the audio. This is something that you'll notice immediately on boot up due to the game starting up with the Dynamite Duke title screen, which also features the sound effect from when you use your screen clearing dynamite punch in game, which sounds like someone farting. I'm not joking at all. If, say, your mother was coming down the hall to see what you were doing and you turned the game on without her being able to see what was up on the screen, it would probably lead to a somewhat embarrassing situation. Once you get past the title screen, the game's audio gets somewhat better, but it's still not great. The music is mediocre at best, and due to the way the game's audio is mixed, it's hard to hear over the sound effects, so even if one of the better background music tracks is playing, you're not going to hear much of it. That leaves you with the sound effects, which, frankly, just like the opening explosive flatulence, border on being offensive in a 16-bit title. I don't think there's a single sound effect in Dynamite Duke that actually makes it sound like it came from a 16-bit machine. I mean, at least the game has sound effects, I suppose, but clearly they weren't a point of emphasis in development, which then makes them being louder than the music that much more confusing. Like, if the sound effects weren't going to be as good as the music, wouldn't you want the music to be louder instead? The only thing I can think of is that they wanted things like the gunfire and the various explosions to be loud to emphasize that it's an action title. In full disclosure, if I'm being honest, the sound in the arcade version of the game isn't great either, and it actually borders on being pretty bad for an arcade machine, probably in hopes that there would be so much noise from players or other machines in the arcade to cover it up. So I guess you could say this is a case of garbage in, garbage out, and it actually would have been surprising if the Genesis version had good audio instead. Aside from any of the technical issues that I've discussed, Dynamite Duke's main problem is something that was also a problem in the original arcade game, although it's slightly more pronounced in the Genesis version, and that's the game's length. Dynamite Duke, being an arcade action game designed to munch quarters, was never long on gameplay, and now the Genesis version, being 2 levels shorter, results in a game where, if you know what you're doing, you can beat the entire game in 15 minutes. Not exactly a great value for home use, especially since this is replicating the single-player experience, so you can't even try to run through the game multiple times with friends. I mean, unless you're taking turns, I guess. This is a prime example of what would have been a good rental title back in the day, because after playing it for a weekend, there really isn't much reason to pull it back out anytime soon. Despite all of its issues, I had fun playing Dynamite Duke this week, and that's something that I can't say has been the case with the 2 previous reviews on the channel. Sometimes it's enough to just be able to mow down hundreds of enemies on the way to taking out a maniacal final boss, and then move on to the next game. However, just because I had fun playing Dynamite Duke, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think it's a good game or worth purchasing. Ultimately, as far as arcade action titles go, I think I land on that the Genesis version is slightly above average, especially for the time period. But the length of the gameplay is just a killer, and unlike something like Altered Beast, it doesn't support 2-player simultaneous play. As a result, I'm giving Dynamite Duke 2 stars, but with the caveat being that if you were a fan of the arcade game, or if you just really like that genre, go ahead and bump it up to 3 stars. This is one that I would definitely recommend players trying before you buy, and maybe throw a quarter in it if you happen to see it in the wild. It could be fun.
And that's it for Dynamite Duke. Now, this review was a little difficult to come up with, believe it or not, because it was a better game than Superman or the Flintstones, but it wasn't good enough for me to really sing its praises either. And it's just easier to come up with material for reviews when you feel strongly one way or the other about something. Looking at Dynamite Duke is sort of like looking at a block of cheese. You see it sitting there on the counter, and you just go in your head, it's like, yeah, that's a block of cheese, all right. And it's the same thing with Dynamite Duke. I mean, you play it and your brain goes, yep, that's a arcade action game from the 80s, all right. So I guess the best thing that I can say about it is, if that's what you're looking for in a game, it definitely hits those marks. Now, next time on the channel, it's another game that squarely has its origins in the arcades. Actually, describing the game as square is not accurate, at least as far as the main character is concerned. However, this particular game never appeared in the arcades and instead was exclusive to 16-bit consoles for over 20 years, until Namco brought out the mothballs to the Nintendo Virtual Console. Like most games on the channel, this is one that I've never played, and I'm actually pretty excited to give it a shot, because I'm not exactly a big fan of the character's previous adventures, and I'm really curious to see, what they could do with him in a completely different environment. I guess the Zilog and Moto adventure will indeed continue next week. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 295. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.